Hello and welcome to Byju's IAS. Let's take up the analysis of today's The Hindu newspaper. The Defence Acquisition Council under the Ministry of Defence, which is headed by the Defence Minister, has approved defence deals worth around 39,000 crore rupees. The approval to these defence deals comes amidst the ongoing border tensions with China, and it has been clearly designed to enhance India's defensive and as well as offensive capabilities. These defence deals, particularly the acquisition of 33 brand new fighter jets from Russia, highlight the significance of Russia as a key defence partner for India. See, just last week, we spoke about the visit of India's defence minister to Russia and his participation in Russia's Victory Day parade. Then yesterday, Prime Minister Modi has congratulated Russian President Putin on winning a constitutional vote which potentially allows him to remain the president of Russia until 2036. This high-level political engagement between India and Russia was basically setting the stage for these defense deals, particularly for the acquisition of new fighter jets from Russia. According to sources, Russia has indicated during these discussions that it is ever ready to meet any defense requirements of India, and this assurance is of great significance considering the heightened tensions that India is dealing with China and as well as with Pakistan. Under the deal to acquire 33 new fighter jets, India is looking to pick up 21 brand new MiG-29 fighter jets from Russia. And Russia would also be assisting the Indian Air Force and the Indian Navy to upgrade around 59 existing MiG-29s in their arsenal. Then the Defence Acquisition Council has also approved the procurement of 12 Sukhoi 30 MKI fighter jets from HAL, which has been licensed by Russia to produce the Indian version of the Sukhoi 30 fighter jets. This deal will help the Indian Air Force to replace the Sukhoi 30 fighter jets that it has lost to crashes and accidents. This deal to acquire new fighter jets comes as a major relief to the Indian Air Force, which has been desperately looking to increase its squadron strength. See, the sanctioned squadron strength for the Indian Air Force to enable it to deal with the twin challenges posed by Pakistan and China is 42. But its current squadron strength has alarmingly fallen to 30 due to the phasing out of the outdated MiG-21s. So if the Indian Air Force has to retain its operational edge, and if it should be in a position to take on the twin challenges posed by Pakistan and China, then there is an urgent need to increase its squadron strength. The Government of India and the Indian Air Force plan to increase the squadron strength by procuring MiG-29s from Russia, by acquiring Sukhoi 30 and LCA Tejas from HAL, and by inducting Rafale fighter jets from France. Apart from the fighter jet deal, the Defence Acquisition Council has also approved the procurement of more Pinaka rocket launchers and the ammunition needed for them. See, the Pinaka is a multi-barrel rocket launcher that has been indigenously developed by the DRDO. It is operated by the Indian Army as a part of its artillery rocket system, and it can fire multiple rockets simultaneously, and this artillery system can be used to neutralize a variety of enemy targets such as exposed enemy troops, armored and soft-skin vehicles, communication centers, air terminal complexes, and ammunition depots. Then the Defence Acquisition Council has also approved a project to upgrade the BMP tanks, which is of Soviet origin. Then in order to boost the long-range attack capabilities of the fighter jets of the Indian Navy and the Indian Air Force, the Defence Acquisition Council has approved the procurement of the Astra Beyond Visual Range missile, which is an air-to-air missile, and as well as the procurement of a long-range land attack missile. The Astra BVRM is an air-to-air missile that has been indigenously developed by the DRDO, and it has already been inducted into the Indian Air Force. Then the long-range land attack missile system is said to be based on the Nirbhai subsonic cruise missile that has been indigenously developed by the DRDO, and it is said to have a range of more than 1,000 kilometers. So if these two missile systems are inducted, then it will significantly boost the long-range attack capabilities of the fighter jets of the Indian Navy and as well as that of the Indian Air Force. Now let's take up another article from page number 1. India loses jurisdiction over Italian Marines case, or also known as the Enrica Lexi case. See, this case dates back to 2012 when two Italian Marines belonging to the Italian Armed Forces who were on board a commercial oil tanker known as Enrica Lexi opened fire against a fishing boat from Kerala while they were navigating through the waters of the Arabian Sea. This shooting incident resulted in the death of the two Indian fishermen, and it ended up turning into a major diplomatic dispute between India and Italy. See, to understand this topic in detail, first we need to understand how maritime boundaries, maritime jurisdiction and maritime rights are defined as per international law, that is, under the UN clause or the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. See, under UN clause, maritime boundaries and jurisdiction are defined by dividing the waters into different zones and categories. This includes internal waters, territorial waters, international waters, and as well as contiguous zone and exclusive economic zone. See, the dotted line that you can see over here is the baseline, which is basically an imaginary line that hugs the coastline of a country, which serves as a reference line for measuring the maritime boundaries. First, let us talk about internal waters. See, all the water bodies that are located behind the baseline, they are classified as internal waters under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. This includes lagoons, deltas, estuaries and backwaters that are present behind the baseline, and they are a part of the country's internal waters. Next, we have territorial waters, which is a part of a country's territorial jurisdiction, which extends for a distance of 12 nautical miles from the baseline. Since territorial waters are a part of a country's territorial jurisdiction, the coastal state enjoys complete sovereignty over territorial waters, and as a result, all the laws of that country are applicable in the territorial waters as well. Then anything beyond territorial waters, that is anything beyond the first 12 nautical miles from the baseline, has been classified as international waters. This is where international law is largely applicable for incidents that take place in this jurisdiction. But beyond the territorial waters, the coastal state enjoys limited powers and limited jurisdiction in two areas or two zones known as the contiguous zone and the exclusive economic zone, which is a part of international waters. Contiguous zone is measured from the point where the territorial waters of the country ends. From here, a distance of another 12 nautical miles is marked out, and this band of water serves as the country's contiguous zone. Then we have exclusive economic zone or EEZ of a country, which extends to a distance of 200 nautical miles measured from the baseline. Now that we have a basic idea as to how maritime boundaries and limits are defined under the UN clause, let us take a more detailed look at the kind of jurisdiction that the coastal state enjoys in these maritime boundaries. First, let's talk about internal waters. See, as we discussed, internal waters covers all water bodies and waterways that are present behind the baseline, that is on the landward side of the baseline. Since these internal waters are a part of a country's territorial jurisdiction, the coastal state is completely free to set laws, to regulate the usage of resources present in these waters, and as well as to regulate the right of passage for shipping vessels in these waters. Since a country enjoys complete sovereignty and jurisdiction in internal waters, foreign vessels do not have the right of passage in these waters, meaning freedom of navigation is not a fundamental right in internal waters. Because otherwise, in international waters, freedom of navigation has been recognized as a basic right under the UN clause. But since freedom of navigation need not be extended to foreign vessels in internal waters, the coastal state can deny the right of passage, and this territorial right and jurisdiction has been recognized under the UN clause. Next, we have territorial waters, which extends up to 12 nautical miles from the baseline. As we discussed, territorial waters are a part of the coastal state's territorial jurisdiction, and hence the coastal state enjoys complete sovereignty, and it is free to set laws, to regulate the usage of resources, and as well as to regulate the movement of ships and submarines. Even in territorial waters, freedom of navigation can be denied by the coastal state, and its Navy and Coast Guard can take any measures within territorial waters in order to protect the interests of the coastal state. So even though foreign vessels do not enjoy the freedom of navigation in territorial waters, they have been given the right of innocent passage. That is, if a foreign vessel can prove to a coastal state that it would pass innocently through the territorial waters, then the required permission can be granted by the coastal state. Even naval ships and submarines can be allowed to pass through a country's territorial waters, provided if they pass innocently through the territorial waters and provided if they have acquired the required permission from the coastal state. See, under the UN-clause convention, innocent passage has been defined as passing through waters in an expeditious and continuous manner, that is without stopping, and the passage of the vessel should not be prejudicial to the peace, good order or the security of the coastal state, which means that the foreign vessel which has been permitted by the coastal state to pass through the territorial waters, it cannot engage in fishing, it cannot pollute the waters, that is, it cannot dump any hazardous waste, it cannot engage in weapons practice, it cannot engage in any espionage or spying activities against the coastal state. Even submarines or underwater vehicles of other countries can be allowed to pass through the territorial waters of a coastal state, but they are required to navigate on the surface and show their flag, and in such cases, the coastal state can grant the right of innocent passage to these foreign vessels as well. Then in territorial waters, the UN-clause convention permits the coastal state to temporarily suspend innocent passage in the interest of its national security. Next, we have contiguous zone, which extends for 12 nautical miles from the edge of the territorial waters. In this zone, which falls under international waters, the coastal state can enforce laws only in 4 specific domains. This includes customs, taxation, immigration and pollution. So if a crime were to take place in the contiguous zone or in any part of the international waters, then such cases fall under the purview of international law, and the coastal state cannot claim to exercise complete jurisdiction over these cases. But however, if the crime has been committed within the territorial waters of the coastal state or within the territory of the coastal state, and if the suspects are fleeing in the contiguous zone, then the authorities of the coastal state can intercept them and arrest them. Similarly, if a vessel passing through the contiguous zone is about to infringe on the rights and jurisdiction of the coastal state, leading to a violation of its laws, even then the authorities can pursue the vessel in the contiguous zone and take appropriate action. This is what makes the contiguous zone the hot pursuit area. Take for example, if a ship has dumped a consignment of drugs or illegal weapons or a bunch of illegal migrants on the coast, and if it is fleeing back into international waters, then the coastal authorities have the right to intercept the ship even if it is passing in the contiguous zone. Similarly, a ship carrying a bunch of terrorists who are about to carry out a terror attack, or a ship carrying a consignment of drugs which is about to make a delivery on the coast, can also be pursued and intercepted by the coastal authorities. So that's the reason why the contiguous zone is also known as the hot pursuit area. Next, we have exclusive economic zone or EEZ, which extends to a distance of 200 nautical miles from the baseline of a country. In this zone, the coastal state enjoys complete exploitation rights over all the natural resources that are present within the EEZ. Since the coastal state has the sole exploitation rights, it can prevent foreign vessels and even other countries from illegally exploiting the resources present within its EEZ. The concept of EEZs was introduced under the UN clause in order to prevent the emergence of maritime disputes between countries over fishing rights, over the exploitation of hydrocarbon resources, etc. Within the EEZ of a coastal state, foreign vessels do enjoy the right to freedom of navigation and overflight, but however, this right can be regulated by the coastal states. Foreign states can even lay submarine pipes and submarine cables in order to transport hydrocarbons and lay OFC cables, but of course, with the permission of the coastal state. This is also the reason why countries tend to fight over small and insignificant islands that are located in the middle of nowhere. Because when a coastal state enjoys sovereignty over a small island that is located far away from its mainland, then the island gets to have its own baseline, and as a result, the island gets to have its own maritime limits and boundaries, including the territorial waters, contiguous zone, and exclusive economic zone. So the ownership of an island located far away from the mainland brings in an additional area of exclusive economic zone under the jurisdiction of the coastal state. See, for example, India's exclusive economic zone has increased significantly due to its sovereignty over the Lakshadweep Islands and as well as over the Andaman and Nicobar Islands. This also explains why China and the Southeast Asian countries are fighting over the ownership of small islands located in the South China Sea. Then coming back to the Enrica Lexie case, you should know that the incident was a result of rampant piracy in the Indian Ocean, near the Horn of Africa, the Gulf of Aden, and off the Somalian coast. See, piracy in this region was at its peak between 2008 and 2012, and numerous incidents of pirate attacks and hijackings of merchant vessels and commercial vessels was reported in the region. So rampant piracy emerging from Somalia was affecting the movement of ships in the Gulf of Aden and Horn of Africa region, thereby posing a direct threat to global shipping. As a part of its counter-piracy measures, the global shipping industry brought in a set of guidelines in 2008 known as the Best Management Practices, which was supposed to be adopted by the shipping vessels passing through the region. As per these guidelines, commercial shipping vessels were allowed to adopt self-protection measures in order to protect the crew from pirate attacks. These guidelines allowed commercial shipping vessels passing through piracy-prone waters to carry armed guards on board. So in order to facilitate the implementation of these best management practices, the International Maritime Organization worked along with the global shipping industry to identify the areas that were vulnerable to pirate attacks in the Indian Ocean, and these vulnerable areas were defined as a high-risk area. In 2008, this high-risk area line was designated at 65 degrees east longitude, which was located quite far away from India's west coast. As you can see in this map, the 65 degree east longitude, which marked the high-risk area line, was located quite far away from the Indian coast. So in order to counter the rising threat of Somalian pirates in the high-risk area, almost all the major powers deployed their respective navies on anti-piracy missions. And this included the Indian Navy, the navies of China, Japan, United Kingdom, France, Italy, US, etc. These countries, which were carrying out anti-piracy operations in the region, even established a contact group based on a resolution of the United Nations in order to promote coordination amongst their navies. So due to these coordinated anti-piracy missions of these navies, the Somalian pirates came under a lot of pressure in the high-risk area, and they started expanding their pirate attacks closer to the Indian coast, and hence by 2011-2012, pirate attacks were being reported near the Lakshadweep Islands as well. So due to these increasing incidents of piracy closer to the Indian coast, the International Maritime Organization and the global shipping industry decided to move the high-risk area line from 65 degrees east longitude to 78 degrees east longitude. So as the high-risk area was extended to 78 degrees east longitude, it ended up coming very close to India's coastline, thereby having a severe impact on India's maritime interests and as well as on India's national security interests. So the extension of the high-risk area closer to the Indian coast ended up having serious implications for India and even contributed to the Enrica Lexie incident. The extension of HRA brought the HRA line as close as about 35 nautical miles from the baseline of India. So this redrawal of the high-risk area in the Indian Ocean ended up affecting India's rights in its exclusive economic zone. Since most of India's exclusive economic zone was classified as a high-risk area, the insurance cost for the ships that were coming to Indian ports and leaving Indian ports increased significantly. See, as per global shipping standards, it is mandatory for merchant vessels to get the goods and the supplies that they are carrying and as well as the ship insured, and the premium that they have to pay for the insurance is dependent on the risk that the ship is taking. So if the ship is passing through a high-risk area as designated by the International Maritime Organization, then an additional war risk premium would be applied on the premium cost, leading to a significant escalation in the insurance cost. This in turn increases the cost of shipping and thereby the cost of Indian exports and Indian imports. And of course, this increased cost would be finally transmitted to the consumer, leading to a huge financial burden for Indian exporters and Indian importers and as well as to the Indian consumer. Then as per the guidelines of the International Maritime Organization and the global shipping industry, commercial ships that were passing through the high-risk area, they were advised to take any evasive action possible in order to deter any pirate attacks. This allowed the commercial ships to station armed guards on board and to even carry weapons on board. This was one of the factors which led to the Enrica Lexi shooting incident, when the Italian Marines on board Enrica Lexi mistook the fishermen from Kerala to be pirates and they opened fire against the fishing boat, leading to the death of these fishermen. That due to increased insurance cost for passing through the high-risk area, commercial ships started to avoid the high-risk area by hugging close to the Indian coastline, and this also led to maritime congestion in Indian waters and even led to a number of collisions and accidents which resulted in the death of around 5 Indian fishermen. But amongst all these incidents, the most high-profile incident has to be the Enrica Lexi case, because in this case, 2 Italian Marines, who are essentially state actors, had opened fire against Indian fishermen by mistaking them for pirates. Since the shooting incident resulted in the death of 2 Indian fishermen, the Indian Navy was dispatched by the Government of India to intercept Enrica Lexi while it was passing through India's contiguous zone, because according to India, the incident took place in India's territorial waters and hence the Indian government had complete jurisdiction over the case. So accordingly, the Indian Navy intercepted the vessel while it was passing through India's contiguous zone, and the Italian Marines were arrested and they were brought back to the Indian mainland and they were taken into custody. After taking them into custody, India was looking to bring murder charges against them, which pushed the Italian government to intervene on their behalf, and this led to the emergence of a major diplomatic dispute between India and Italy. Italy claimed that India had no jurisdiction over this case because according to the Italian government, the incident took place in international waters, and moreover, the Italian soldiers enjoy immunity from criminal charges in another country as they are state representatives of the Italian government, and at the time of the incident, they were on a mission representing the interests of the Italian government. But India countered these claims of Italy by insisting that the shooting had taken place in India's territorial waters and hence neither international law nor UN clause provisions would apply, and instead India's domestic laws would apply in this case. This diplomatic dispute escalated to such an extent that Italy started to exert diplomatic pressure on India in various ways. At the Nuclear Suppliers Group, while India was trying to seek an entry into the NSG, Italy deliberately voted against India. Italy also tried to derail the ongoing free trade negotiations between India and the European Union. It also dragged other members of the European Union and the NATO group to exert diplomatic pressure on India. Italy even tried to make use of its connections with the Vatican Church to exert pressure on the Christian leaders of Kerala, who could further exert pressure on the Indian government in order to secure the release of these Marines. Finally, both the countries reached a partial settlement, and India agreed for a conditional release of the Marines. After detaining them in India for several years, India decided to send them back to Italy even as the case progressed in Indian courts. But after the Marines returned to Italy, the Italian government took up the case at the Permanent Court of Arbitration, which is located at The Hague in Netherlands, as mandated by the provisions of the UN clause. Because the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea states that any maritime disputes will be settled through arbitration at the Permanent Court of Arbitration. Now the PCA has ruled that India has no jurisdiction over this case as per the provisions of UN clause, and it has recognized that the Marines were state representatives of the Italian government who enjoy immunity in this case, and they cannot be prosecuted as per Indian law. But the Permanent Court of Arbitration has recognized that India's freedom of navigation was indeed violated by this incident, and hence the fishermen who died and as well as the other fishermen who were on board and their respective families are eligible for compensation to be paid by the Italian government for the physical damage and the moral harm that has been caused to them. Now let's take up another article from page number 1. As India is all set to see the introduction of private trains from April 2023, fears have increased over increased ticket prices and loss of jobs. Because see, until now, the public sector, that is the Ministry of Railways, has enjoyed complete monopoly in this sector. But the decision of the Modi government to open up railways to the private sector and allow private operators to run private trains has led to fears that the ticket prices would increase substantially, which could make train travel unaffordable, especially for the weaker sections. And it has also led to fears that there would be loss of jobs in the public sector. But the chairman of the Railway Board has responded to these fears, and he has given out an assurance by stating that these fears are unfounded Because according to him, the introduction of private trains will not result in an increase in ticket prices and it will not translate to loss of jobs. Because once these private trains become operational, they will have to compete with the ticket prices of the public sector trains that would be operated by the Ministry of Railways, and they should also compete with bus fare and as well as air tickets in order to remain in competition. So according to the chairman of the railway board, this competition in the market would automatically moderate the ticket prices of private trains as well. Then he has also said that the introduction of private players in the railway sector will break the monopoly of the public sector, leading to the introduction of modern technology, greater efficiency and more private investments, which will eventually increase the capacity of Indian Railways. Next, on page number 6, we have a column written by former diplomat T.P. Srinivasan, who has served as the ambassador to India's mission to the United Nations in New York. And through this column, he goes on to evaluate the priorities and challenges for India as a non-permanent member of the UN Security Council. But since we have covered this topic recently, there is no need to discuss this article again, but I would request you to go through the column once. In this column, the writer talks about the increasing reputation of India at the United Nations due to its increased global profile, and he goes on to explain why counter-terrorism would be India's topmost priority as a non-permanent member of the UNSC. Now let's take up the practice questions for today. Who is considered as the father of modern statistics in India? The correct answer is option C. It is P.C. Mahalanobis. See, Prasanta Chandra Mahalanobis is a legendary statistician and mathematician from India. He is popularly referred to as the father of Indian statistics, and he founded the Indian Statistical Institute and was one of the key members of the first Planning Commission of India. It was Mahalanobis who introduced the concept of planned governance to the Planning Commission that was based on the Soviet model of planned development, and it was Mahalanobis who gave very high priority to industrialization, especially to the development of heavy industries under India's second 5-year plan. That's the reason why the second 5-year plan is also referred to as the Mahalanobis plan. He is also recognized globally for devising the Mahalanobis distance, which is a statistical measure which is frequently used in the studies of population distribution. He is also known for his work in the field of anthropometry, which is the study of human measurements. He is also credited for introducing the concept of pilot surveys and designing large-scale sample surveys which are used even today in statistical exercises. His birth anniversary, which falls on the 29th of June, is celebrated by the Government of India as the National Statistics Day. This question has been asked because according to this article on page number 11, the former governor of RBI, C. Rangarajan, has been awarded the P.C. Mahalanobis Lifetime Achievement Award in recognition of his contribution to the field of official statistics. Now let's take up the next practice question. Which of the following tiger reserves are located in Uttar Pradesh? Amangarh Tiger Reserve, Dudhwa Tiger Reserve, Rajaji Tiger Reserve, Jim Corbett Tiger Reserve, Pilibhit Tiger Reserve. The correct answer is option C, 1, 2 and 5 only. This question has been asked because according to this article on page number 11, a proposal has been made to declare the Shivalik Forest Range in the Saharanpur division as a tiger reserve. This proposal has come from the Saharanpur Divisional Commissioner and it has been made to the UP government, which is likely to take it up with the central government. But the final approval for establishing the Shivalik Forest Range as a tiger reserve will have to come from the Ministry of Environment and Forest, the National Tiger Conservation Authority and the National Board for Wildlife. Now let's take up the next practice question. The popular Okavango Delta is located in which country? The correct answer is option C, Botswana. This question has been asked because according to this article on page number 14, hundreds of elephants have been found dead in the popular Okavango Delta of Botswana. See, Botswana is a country located in southern Africa and it is bordered by South Africa, Namibia, Zimbabwe and Zambia. The most important feature about this landlocked country is that it has the highest number of elephants in the world and most of them are concentrated in the Okavango Delta that is formed by the Okavango River in the Kalahari Basin. The death of these large number of elephants continues to remain a mystery, but experts have ruled out anthrax and poaching as a possible reason. Because autopsies conducted on some of these elephant carcasses have ruled out the possibility of anthrax, And even poaching has been ruled out as a possible reason because the elephant tusks have remained untouched. Now let's take up a practice question from the 2016 prelims paper. With reference to Agenda 21, sometimes seen in the news, consider the following statements. It is a global action plan for sustainable development. It originated in the World Summit on Sustainable Development held in Johannesburg in 2002. Amongst the given statements, the first statement is correct, but the second statement is incorrect. So option A is the right answer. See, Agenda 21 was adopted at the Rio Earth Summit, which was held in 1992, which is seen as the mother of all environment-related summits and conventions. Because the Rio Earth Summit gave birth to a number of important conventions and treaties, including the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the Convention on Biological Diversity, the UN Convention to Combat Desertification, and as well as Agenda 21. Agenda 21 is basically a global action plan for the 21st century in order to promote sustainable development. In fact, it is Agenda 21 which formed the basis for the Sustainable Development Goals of the UN, which is also referred to as Agenda 2030. Finally, let's take up a couple of mains practice questions. The first question, in 2012, the longitudinal marking of the high risk areas for piracy was moved from 65 degrees east to 78 degrees east in the Arabian Sea by the International Maritime Organization. What impact does this have on India's maritime security concerns? Please note that this is a question that I have taken from the 2014 UPSC mains question paper. Let's look at the second question. Write a detailed note on the classification of maritime boundaries and jurisdiction as defined by the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. Kindly write an answer to these questions and post your answers in the comment section below. So this concludes our discussion for the day. Thanks for watching.